Iran's supreme leader is being buried in Mashhad this week. Millions of mourners flooding the streets of Tehran chanting for revenge. Every camera on Earth pointed at that funeral, and at the exact same hour, in a headline, almost nobody is connecting to the coffin. Iran told the United Nations nuclear watchdog no access denied, 2 facilities only. But there is one nuclear site Iran just quietly reopened, and it is not for Washington, it is for Moscow. If you think the funeral is the story this week, I want to show you why it is actually the distraction. Let's start with the man in the coffin, because you need to understand exactly what died with him. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei ran Iran for 37 years. He was killed on February 28, 2026, in the opening strike of the war between Israel, the United States, and Iran, along with members of his own family. For 4 months, his body lay waiting while the war raged around it. And then finally, from July 4th to July 9th, Iran gave him the funeral it had been holding in reserve. Processions through Tehran's Grand Mosalla, then on to Najaf and Karbala in Iraq, then finally burial beside one of Shia Islam's holiest shrines in Mashhad. Iranian officials floated mourner numbers as high as 15 to 20 million across the ceremonies, though I want to flag clearly that figure is Iran's own official estimate, not something independently verified by anyone outside the state. Mourners carried placards openly calling for revenge against the American president and the Israeli prime minister. And his son, Mojtaba Khamenei, was named successor within a week of his father's death, but still, as of this funeral, has not appeared in public. Think about that for a second. The most powerful position in the entire Islamic Republic, occupied right now by a man the public has not actually seen. Now, to understand why this moment matters so much, you have to understand this isn't Iran's first time standing at exactly this crossroads. Go back to 2015. Iran signed the JCPOA, the nuclear deal that traded away most of its enrichment capacity in exchange for sanctions relief. 3 years later, in 2018, the United States walked away from that deal entirely and reimposed sanctions under a strategy openly called maximum pressure. Iran kept enriching. And then in June of 2025, Israel launched what became known as the 12-Day War, striking Iranian nuclear and military facilities directly, with the United States joining in on strikes of its own before the fighting ended in a ceasefire. That was the dress rehearsal. February 28, 2026 was the sequel, and this time it didn't stop after 12 days. It became a full war, one that killed the supreme leader of Iran himself. So when I tell you Iran is being cagey about nuclear inspections right now, understand this is a country that has been down this exact road twice already and has learned both times that opening the door all the way does not stop the bombs from coming. Now here is where I want you to stop watching the coffin and start watching the paperwork. On July 1st, just 3 days before the funeral processions began, Iran's parliament speaker and chief nuclear negotiator Mohammad Bakir Qalibaf went on state television and said something that got almost no attention outside specialist circles. He dismissed reports that Iran had agreed to expand access for the International Atomic Energy Agency, called them false, and he said this, word for word: "Access has been limited exclusively to these 2 sites, and we remain committed to that arrangement. The 2 sites he's talking about are the Bushehr nuclear power plant and the Tehran research reactor. Nothing else, not Natanz, not Iraq, not the enrichment sites the entire war was fought over in the first place." He added on the same broadcast, "If we are weak on this path, we will be humiliated. That is not the language of a man quietly complying. That is the language of a man drawing a line in permanent ink." And here's the part that makes this genuinely strange. The head of the IAEA, Rafael Grossi, is on the record saying the exact opposite. He has said the memorandum of understanding signed between the US and Iran leaves no room for ambiguity on inspections, and that supervised inspections are, in his words, going to happen, with dates and locations still being worked out with Tehran. So you have the chief of the UN's nuclear watchdog saying inspections are coming, and Iran's own chief negotiator saying on state television 3 days before his supreme leader's funeral that access will never go beyond 2 facilities. Those 2 positions cannot both be true. Somebody is going to lose this argument, and I don't think it's going to be Iran. Here's why I say that, and here's why the sites Iran is refusing to open matter as much as the ones it's keeping shut. During the war, strikes hit Natanz, damaging the above-ground access points to its underground enrichment halls. Strikes hit Iraq's heavy water production plant, and strikes hit Bushehr itself at least 4 separate times, including one that destroyed a structure roughly 350 meters from the reactor. Iran has, in the time since, denied the IAEA access to roughly 20 declared nuclear sites in violation of its own safeguards agreement, according to independent nuclear monitoring analysis. The one consistent exception, the one site Iran has kept the IAEA physically present at, watching refueling operations, is Bushehr. Now watch what happens at that exact site this month. Bushehr is Iran's only operational nuclear power plant, and it was built in partnership with Russia's state nuclear corporation, Rosatom. Rosatom evacuated hundreds of its own staff out of Iran when the war started on February 28th. And now, according to Rosatom's own head speaking to the Interfax news agency, the company is sending its people back to Bushehr starting in the middle of July. Right now. This same week as the funeral. So Iran isn't refusing inspections everywhere. Iran is refusing inspections at every single site connected to the damage Washington and Israel actually caused, while simultaneously reopening the one site connected to its relationship with Moscow. That is not a blanket policy of secrecy. That is a filtered policy, and I want to give it a name because I think it explains almost everything else happening around Iran right now. I call it the split door doctrine. One door, the one connected to Russia, gets pushed open, staffed, and kept running. The other door, the one connected to the country that just bombed you, gets bolted shut, reinforced, and defended on state television using the word never. Same government, same week. Two completely different postures depending entirely on who's asking to walk through. Now let's widen the lens, because the split door doctrine doesn't stop at nuclear facilities. Iran's commercial attaché in Doha, Abbas Abdolkhani, confirmed that maritime trade between Iran and Qatar has resumed after roughly 5 months of suspension, with shipping between Iran's Deir port and Qatar's Al Ruwais port restarting through direct coordination with Qatari authorities. That's real, functioning civilian commerce flowing again. At the same time, Qalibaf revealed that $6 billion in frozen Iranian assets has already been released, with another $6 billion pledged, following Iranian travel to Doha and Qatari mediation. So money is moving, trade is moving. Diplomacy with Qatar specifically is moving forward fast enough that Qatar's own foreign ministry spokesman, Majed Al-Ansari, described the July 1st technical talks in Doha as positive progress on the broader Memorandum of Understanding. And yet, in that same window of time, Iran's military headquarters issued a direct warning that any American interference in the Strait of Hormuz will be met with what they called a decisive and swift response. And Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian went out of his way to state publicly that Iran's missile program was never part of the Memorandum of Understanding, and in his words, will never be. So walk through what Iran actually did in the span of about 10 days. Open trade with Qatar, accepted billions in released assets, allowed positive progress language out of Doha, and in that exact same window, locked the IAEA out of every war-damaged site, reopened Bushehr specifically for Russia, drew a hard line on Hormuz, and took missiles off the table entirely. That is not a country stumbling through chaotic diplomacy. That is a country opening exactly the doors that bring in money and allies, and sealing exactly the doors that would let outsiders verify anything about its actual military capability. There's a deeper strategic reason this makes sense if you understand what Iran's nuclear program actually is right now. Independent analysts, including researchers at the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, have described Iran's posture for years as nuclear hedging, building, and maintaining the technical infrastructure to assemble a weapon on short notice without actually crossing the line into full weaponization, using that ambiguity itself as leverage in negotiations. If that analysis is right, then the entire value of Iran's nuclear program right now isn't in using it. It's in the uncertainty around it. Full transparency at every site would end that uncertainty completely, and with it, Iran's single biggest point of leverage over Washington, which means the split door doctrine isn't a diplomatic accident, it's the entire strategy. Show enough at Bushehr to claim cooperation, reveal nothing at the sites that would actually resolve the ambiguity the whole strategy depends on. Now, I want to Steelman the other reading of this, because I think it deserves real consideration before I tell you why I don't buy it as the full picture. Here's the strongest version of the argument that Iran is actually negotiating in good faith. Qatar itself, a genuinely neutral mediator with every incentive to be honest about the state of talks, is calling this positive progress. Billions of dollars in frozen assets are actually moving, not just being promised. Trade with a Gulf neighbor has resumed. Iran allowed IAEA access at Bushehr even during an active war, and has kept that access open continuously since. From that vantage point, you could argue Iran is doing exactly what a country trying to rebuild trust after a devastating war should do. Take the wins that are available, restore what commerce it can, and negotiate the harder issues like enrichment site access more slowly and carefully, because the domestic political cost of appearing to fold to Washington so soon after burying its supreme leader would be enormous for a government that just told its own mourning population it answered the martyred leader's call with strength. That argument is not irrational. I want to be fair to it. But here is what that argument cannot explain. It cannot explain why the one facility Iran keeps open just happens to be the one built and staffed by Russia, while every facility connected to American and Israeli strikes remains sealed in violation of Iran's own safeguards agreement, according to independent monitoring groups. If this were simply cautious, good faith diplomacy, you would expect Iran to at least gesture toward opening access at a damaged site, even symbolically, to build trust the same way it's building trust with Qatar on trade. Instead, Qalibaf went on television and used the word committed exclusively about the two sites Iran already controls, one of which Russia already has boots on the ground inside of again as of this month. Good faith diplomacy doesn't usually come paired with a public declaration that access will not expand under any circumstances, delivered 3 days before a funeral built entirely around projecting national defiance. And that's not caution. That's a wall with Russia's name already painted on the one door left open in it. So here's what I think happens next, and I want to be clear that this is analysis, not certainty. Scenario 1. Iran continues the exact pattern we're seeing right now. More trade normalization with Qatar, more asset releases, more positive language out of Doha, while quietly using the Bushehr-Rosatom relationship as proof that Iran is technically complying with some inspection regime, even as the actual war-damaged sites Grossi wants access to remain permanently off limits. Iran gets to claim cooperation while giving up almost nothing that matters to the ambiguity it actually depends on. Scenario 2, Grossi and the IAEA push hard enough, backed by Washington, that Tehran is forced to at least allow a token inspection at one non-Bushehr site, purely to keep the 60-day clock on the broader memorandum from collapsing, without any of that translating into a real accounting of the damaged enrichment facilities or the status of Iran's uranium stockpile. And scenario 3, the one I think is genuinely underrated right now, the disagreement over Hormuz and inspections becomes the excuse both sides use to let talks quietly die without either side taking the blame, with Iran pointing to Grossi's public statements as evidence Washington moved the goalposts, and Washington pointing to Qalibaf's July 1st statement as evidence Iran never intended to comply in the first place. Here's what I want you to watch in the next 48 to 72 hours to figure out which of those three we're actually heading toward. First, watch whether Rosatom's returning staff at Bushehr are accompanied by any expanded IAEA presence, or whether Russia's return happens in total isolation, with the IAEA still locked out everywhere else in the country. Second, watch whether Qatar's positive progress language turns into any specific named concession on inspection access, or whether it stays confined entirely to money and trade while the nuclear question goes quietly unmentioned in every joint statement. And third, watch whether Washington responds publicly to Qalibaf's July 1st statement at all. Silence there would tell you almost as much as a response would, because a superpower that lets a direct contradiction of its own vice president's earlier claims go unanswered is a superpower that has already decided this particular fight isn't worth having yet. I'll be honest with you, I could be wrong about how this plays out. These are my frameworks, not certainties, and I want you to push back on me if you think I'm missing something. But here's what I keep coming back to. A government that is genuinely rebuilding trust after a war usually tries to prove it across the board, the way Iran is currently proving it to Qatar, with real ships moving real cargo. What we're watching instead, at the exact same time, is a government proving trust selectively to exactly one partner while treating every other door as permanently closed and defending that closure on television in the same week it's burying the man who ran the country for 37 years. The funeral gave Iran the perfect cover for exactly this kind of move. A nation visibly grieving, visibly united, millions of cameras fixed entirely on the coffin and the crowd, while the actual decisions about who gets access to what get made quietly in the background 3 days before anyone outside specialist circles was even watching for them. If you want to check this yourself, go read Qalibaf's full July 1st remarks as they were reported on Iranian state media. Go read Rafael Grossi's comments from his press conference in Japan on the Memorandum of Understanding. And go look at the Rosatom statement to Interfax about the Bushehr staff return. Read all three side by side and then ask yourself the question I can't stop asking. If Iran genuinely intends to comply with a real inspection regime, why does the only open door in the entire country lead straight to Moscow?